Hello, beautiful people. It's your girl Shakima. I'm actually just stopping in for another well overdue podcast for today's Tools for Using Tools Tuesday segment. Sending you guys much love. Today's topic, we're actually going to be talking about combating suicides and suicidal thoughts in itself. So, this is us going a little bit further into the art of spiritual warfare to look a little bit deeper to see if we can get some sense of clarity amidst the storm. Stay tuned. All right, guys, I hope everybody is having an awesome day today. I know it's a pretty heavy topic for us today, but it really is just a case of keeping the vibes high and keeping the energy flowing in the right direction. The intention in this space tonight is to really just give us an opportunity to have an open floor and open dialogue, to just go a little bit deeper into topics that may be a little bit taboo, but these are just some of the things that we're sort of experiencing on a day-to-day basis. One of the reasons I was actually inspired to come into this space to speak about suicide, I've said it probably maybe 2 or 3 podcast episodes ago, where I said I wanted to go a little bit deeper into suicide. I think even the podcast about narcissism. And just kind of watching and seeing the epidemic of how suicide is really taking a lot of lives at the minute, or it's kind of forcing a lot of egos to take out the lives of their avatars prematurely, just because we're not necessarily equipped. We don't necessarily know what tools we have to use and how to effectively utilize our tools to navigate through something like the shadow of depression, which in turn, if it gets manic, can turn into a state of suicidal thoughts manifested as an outcome. So we're just going to go ahead and sort of peel back some of the layers to get a little bit more insight, get a little bit deeper with suicide. What is suicide? Where does it come from? We're going to talk about why we do sort of have suicidal thoughts, for one, and how to overcome some of these thoughts just on a day-to-day basis, as they may sort of show up in the back of our mind subconsciously or in the forefront of our conscious mind. We're also just going to be talking about, some of the daily challenges that may trigger suicidal thoughts, and how to just combat some of these thoughts on a daily basis, weekly sort of routines that we can get into, bi-weekly recommendations, and also monthly sort of suggestions to be able to just give you guys an opportunity to work your way through the shadow of suicide as it may show up. Hey, Antonio, thank you for joining into the space. Welcome, welcome. So first thing that I've got on my list, what is suicide? Because it's such a taboo subject. It's kind of like somebody says that they are having suicidal thoughts and all of a sudden they're shunned, by society. They need help. It's a specialized case, and don't get me wrong, it is a very specialized case, but that specialized case is knowing that the individual has the tools within themselves to be able to navigate through whatever challenge it is that they're sort of going through at the minute that is showing up as a suicidal thought manifested. So a lot of the times when we're going through pressurized situations, i.e., I mentioned, manic depression, for some people, we don't even realize that we're depressed half the time. We assume that depression is a severe or chronic state that kind of leaves us being isolated. In some cases, that is how it manifests. And for those of us that aren't necessarily sure whether or not we are going through a case of, the dark night of the soul traveling, as it's considered when we sort of battle with depression, sometimes that can lead to suicidal thoughts. And, when we're going through thoughts of suicide, we need to kind of get to pretty much why suicide is showing up. What part of our ego is actually being forced to grow? What part of our consciousness is actually being forced to evolve beyond our previous circumstances? Because a lot of the times you'll find that when you're sort of, faced with suicidal thoughts, you're either going through a life transition or you're about to go through a significant change in your life. So it really is just indicative of old energy dying, technically energy doesn't die, but it's almost being transmuted. So that old energy, that old perspective, that old viewpoint somehow is dying. That's what we consider to be ego deaths. And ego deaths can manifest suicidal thoughts a lot of the times simply because an ego is dying, a perspective is going. And with that, as we're growing into something else, it will manifest thoughts of death, because that's essentially what's happening. Whatever cell that was, it does kind of almost put that cell in an experience of itself. It heightens it. That's generally what sort of happens when we're sort of tuning in, because a lot of the times we don't realize exactly how much we put our body through, and we don't really sort of take the time to sit with ourselves to be consciously aware enough what is going on within our body. So a lot of the times there are certain cells that are screaming out. They're sort of saying certain things, our body speaking directly to us, essentially. And sometimes when we don't know the language of our body, which beats me, because I think that so often in society in general, we spend so much time, like I say, engaging with other people, trying to help other people with their own issues. Sometimes we don't necessarily take the time that we need to be able to look within ourselves to gain more of an understanding and an understanding of self, to know exactly what we're sort of going through. And I think in a society today where emotions or any sign of emotion is, I know we're going through a turning point where we're sort of changing from this, but emotions are perceived to be a sign of weakness. But essentially we have an emotional body. The human body is an emotional processor, so it processes emotions. So for us to not be in a position where we're taught essentially how to process emotions, it pretty much leaves us powerless to the biggest weapon that we potentially have, which is ourselves. And I think that's kind of why I wanted to be able to have this conversation. That's kind of why I wanted to be able to just open the floor for us to be able to just take back responsibility, take accountability for what we are able to control, because there are a lot of factors. And that's what happens a lot of the times when we do sort of find ourselves in situations where we're dealing with deep depression to the point where it manifests itself as suicidal thoughts. I think that when we get to that place in our lives, it's really just speaking volumes to the fact that there is some sort of change that needs to take place. There's some sort of growth that is about to take place, as I mentioned. So what is suicide? Going back to it, suicide is pretty much your body letting you know that the old you is dying. It is pretty much your conscious mind now engaging into the fact that a part of your DNA is going through a transformation. It is essentially a part of your consciousness that is evolving into a higher state, a higher belief, a higher perspective. And it's normal. I think I really just want to put that out there. That's probably the first thing that I should have started with. Suicide and suicidal thoughts are normal. Why? Because as we go through a transitioning process of going from one version of self to the next, we will find ourselves with situations where we're sort of, feeling like parts of ourselves wants to die, because that's the reality. A part of ourselves is dying, and we have to engage to understand exactly what part of our consciousness is dying, exactly what part of our experience that is no longer serving us is actually now being sacrificed. Essentially, it's like a default program that is being sacrificed. It's an ego death. It's a sub-personality. In a lot of cases, it's a sub-personality dying. So the things that conditions your personality, your experiences in life that conditions your personality, these are actually parts or facets of our personalities, right? And as we're sort of in those situations where we're pretty much engaging subconsciously with those personalities, playing out different experiences in our lives, and casting people in different roles in our lives based on, again, said personalities' experiences. So for somebody who is used to basically emotional manipulation or emotional neglect, they may be someone that is prone to find themselves in situations where they continue to repeat cycles of emotional neglect, and emotional manipulation over and over and over again. It may be that they show up as somebody that's emotionally neglectful of a counterpart, a loved one, or they may be the one sort of prone to being on the receiving end of that kind of energy. So it's really just a case of identifying that, okay, this exists within myself. There is a cell within me. There is a DNA trait within myself that still remembers, because the body remembers pain. The body remembers everything. It's just that the mind is a super advanced computer that archives information. So as our body is seeking to remember every single experience by way of emotion, so attaching an emotional signature or residue to every single experience. That's why we have nostalgic feelings. Sometimes it takes us back to certain experiences when we hear certain songs. It's the muscle memory of certain things, whatever tension your body was experiencing, or whatever how can I put it, whatever pattern or sequence that was embedded into your DNA coding at the time of said experience. Every time you have something that reminds you, i.e., again, a music track, for instance, of that experience, it takes you back to that memory. You automatically see it flash within the third eye, in the mind's eye, where it's playing out the sequence of that experience in the back of your mind. So in your subconscious mind, that is what your mind is letting you know is taking place. Your mind is letting you know that, okay, this situation actually triggers this memory for me, or this song triggers this memory for me. Why? Because this is the moment that I connected an emotion to it, and this is the imprint of that pretty much playing out. Now, when we get to situations where some of those sub-personalities, some of those versions of ourselves basically are getting an opportunity to expand itself, to evolve, it is going to die. And as that part of ourself, that part of our personality, that facet of ourself dissipates, there is a likelihood that we will start to hear whispers. We'll start to hear whispers of those demons, basically, for lack of a better way of putting it. I speak about the fact that we're in the art of spiritual warfare, and when we're talking about suicidal thoughts, we're talking about direct combat with dark spirits. We're speaking about direct, how can I put it, infiltration of dark spirits, direct infiltration of dark angels, fallen angels, as they call it. So when we sort of find ourselves in a situation where we're dealing with suicide and suicidal thought, and even for the people around us that may find themselves in a situation where they are sort of dealing with suicide and suicidal thoughts, it really is just a case of them being able to ride the wave of that experience. It isn't something that is, permanent. It is a temporary situation. One of the things that I definitely recommend is getting to know and identify self, because the more we know about self, the more we know our demons, the more we know our shadows. The better we know our shadows, the better we know thyself, the better equipped we are at being able to deal with the issues that may come along with some of these demons, some of these shadows that may or may not have been addressed. And even when we do address certain issues, guys, I want to explain that there's layers to these situations. You may be faced one day with a situation of rejection, and beneath that rejection, you see that neglect was the action that triggered the reaction or feeling of, neglect, feeling like you were rejected, essentially. Being neglected, the action of neglect, allowing for you to feel rejection by that neglect. It really is just going deeper into the layers of oneself to understanding the sequence and pattern of your DNA, the foldings of your muscles, basically. Have we ever stopped to think about, what the expressions, the strands, the just the actual patterns of the sequence of our DNA? What does it mean? What does it represent? How does it represent us? What does the encoding of it all mean, considering that there's so many facets of our DNA infused to actually create life in itself? Some of us, we come from so many multicultural backgrounds, and with that as well, there's a lot of generational baggage that we sort of take on as well. There's a lot of generational experiences that may impact our ability to be able to navigate our way through suicidal thoughts. For instance, um, even stuff like, depending on what your parents' drug use was like, for instance, how what vibration was their cannabinoid system on, for instance, because that gives us a direct portal to the third eye, the cannabinoid system. And again, the third eye will allow for us to be able to engage in these types of communication, because essentially it's almost like, how can I put it? It's like when thoughts are being manifested, they are the byproduct of an emotion. I know that we're taught, and I've said this before, that thought happens and then emotion takes place. I don't believe that to be the case. I believe in the five elements or aspects of life, which to me personally, as spirit has given it to me, the universe's greatest teacher, water is the element of emotion, which goes through a process of basically the unseen realms coming into a mental experience. So I would say that, after water, there would be the element of the ethereals, the ethereal realm. And beyond the ethereal realm, after water, essentially, essentially there would potentially be water after the ethereal realms, but just bear with me. Follow me if you can with this, right? With the ethereal realms, then there's the element of air, and the element of air is all about communication. So now this is where life is picking up. This is where the thoughts that were a byproduct of the emotions, which is the element of water, the thoughts being the ethereal realm, the unseen realm, the realm of mentalism, right? That's where, once we're able to communicate, now we're sort of bringing things into tangible manifestation, which is the element of earth. So that's the dance, if you will, or the symphony of all five of the different elements, allowing for manifestation to take shape and form. And what we don't take enough time to really do is understand what forces may be intercepting the different process. So what force at the point of emotion maybe intercepting the types of thoughts that are being triggered. So for me, when I've been faced with suicide or thoughts in the past, I literally, even coming into my 30th cycle, I've just had my birthday on the 21st, guys. Woo! That literally, let's give me a round of applause for birthday. Actually, I think that we want to do that. Yeah. Awesome stuff, guys. It was my birthday. That was awesome. We loved it. It was a great experience, right? But it was coming into my 30th cycle. And just before I came into my 30th cycle, I actually realized that, there were so many parts of myself that was dying. There was a voice. I remember when I was going through suicidal thoughts for like 6 weeks straight, and I was on suicide ward on Shadow Island, as I call it. Shadow Island is basically where every soul goes when we're going through a dark night of the soul. I call it Shadow Island. It's when the ego goes and gets lost in sequences of emotions, and we have to try to find our way out. We have to learn how to navigate our way from the deepest, darkest parts of our emotions and back into a lighter reflection, a little bit lesser version of ourselves as far as density, right? On Shadow Island, however, there is suicide ward. That's how I consider it. Suicide ward is basically where people that are dealing with suicidal thoughts, that's where the universe is kind of dealing with them in a one-to-one. It's kind of the way that I like to consider it is like God's personalized hospital, where everybody goes to be able to get the kind of healing that they need as per wherever they are on their journey, right? So whilst I was on suicide ward at Shadow Island Hospital, it was really a case of me getting a deeper understanding of why suicide was showing up. What is suicide? What's suicide's intention? Basically, a lot of the times we have suicidal thoughts and then we're just scared. We're scared that we're going to die. We don't engage. We don't know how to actually process suicide. Can I just say that? We don't know how to process the vibration or emotion that may manifest as suicidal thoughts, which is a real shame, because this is probably why it's taking so many lives. when really all suicide, from my personal experience anyways, is trying to do is really give us an opportunity to recognize our power, not succumb to our weaknesses. I think that it's really just some of those situations where it's unfortunate, where we're not able to see beyond whatever circumstance we're going through in that particular moment. And when suicide shows up, it's really just kind of saying, do you believe in yourself? Do you consider yourself to be fearless? Do you consider yourself to be a leader? Do you consider yourself to be all that you would like to think that you're worthy of? Because then the universe wants to test you. This is the universe's ultimate test to you. Where does suicide come from? As far as the suicidal thoughts, I feel like I've explained that a little bit. Suicidal thoughts are a tangible manifestation of depressed feelings. Depressed feelings will manifest as suicidal thoughts because we're going through a really significant time where we're under a lot of pressure. A lot of the times when we go into depressive states, it's because we feel like, our circumstances are severely intense and overwhelming to the point where we may not be willing to see a way out in that particular moment. And that's okay. I just want to put that across. I'm not saying to, set up shop, make home, build camp, and just decide that that's your new living place as far as being in that low vibration. No, but we do have to work our way from one point to the next. And that's what suicide is. Suicide is working our way from one version of self into the next version of self. And as we're getting into that next version of self, there are certain aspects of our character and identity that has to be sacrificed. There's certain egos that will die in the process as we do so. Why do we have them? Because it's a necessary part of the evolution process. I've mentioned to you, I mentioned on my IG live earlier that why I was inspired to come into this space. Firstly, Caroline Flacken, her untimely death because of her sacrifice. Essentially, it was a spiritual sacrifice for her to sort of put herself in a position where she's now in spirit, and she started her journey, the next phase of her journey, in fact, in spirit, because energy never dies, it simply transfers. So just because her physical body has, is going through its process of dissipating, doesn't mean that her consciousness doesn't still live in the energy around us. And it also lives within the people that did know her personally as well. So it's definitely something that kind of is transferable. But for the most part, just kind of going back on what I was saying before, I think that when we are dealing with situations of why do we have suicidal thoughts, it is because in most cases there are a lot of things that we're resentful about. There's a lot of things that we're frustrated about. There's a lot of things that we're unhappy about basically in our lives, and suicide is showing up to let us know that we need to acknowledge those things. We're either going to do something about it to see change come into the space, or we may kind of succumb basically to the pressure of the change whilst it's taking place. And that's what happens when we actually go into the process of actioning those suicidal thoughts, because it's one thing to have suicidal thoughts, but we don't necessarily have to action every thought. And I think that if that's the biggest thing that I can sort of put across when it comes to suicidal thoughts, is that not every thought is worth engaging in. And even when we see a thought, there's about a 17 seconds time span where our brain kind of engages with that thought, and we have the option. So whether or not we actually submit to a thought is an option. Within the first 17 seconds, if we choose to disengage from that thought, then we don't submerge ourselves into that thought. For myself personally, I like to be able to process my emotions, so I generally do submerge into the thoughts. I don't advise that for everyone, because it's very difficult if you don't have a personal relationship with self, especially with your inner child. It can be very, very dark trying to travel through each and every low vibrational thought that shows up, trying to get your attention. So I don't recommend it for everyone. Personal disclaimer there. But we do have them as a necessary, how can I put it? It's kind of like a necessary evil for us to be able to get to a better version of ourselves. I don't even really like to call it that. But it's really just kind of letting us know that there's parts of ourselves that does need to change. And as we are going through a process of a transition, there is parts of ourselves that's dying, and it's up to us whether or not we're willing to actually engage in the process. And that's what happens a lot of the times as we're going through life, right? We're not so engaged in the process of life taking place, and then we have a moment where we have a significant dip, as they say in scriptures. We go through the valley of the shadow of death. I call it the shadow of the valley of ego death, because egos are dying in those valleys. The darkest parts of ourselves, we're going through a process of being pressurized into the diamonds that we are, and we're losing fragments of ourselves in the process, because we're becoming more of who we are authentically versus the nature of who we've become through the process of the pressure of dealing with the circumstances. So the experiences that have basically conditioned the version of us that people experience on any given day. With those types of situations, when we find ourselves, where we're in positions of having suicidal thoughts as a result of being pressurized by our circumstances, it really is a case that once we're able to get to the other side of that experience, there's so much joy, beauty, and it's almost mastering the shadow and element of suicide to be able to allow for parts of yourself to die, and just kind of integrate other parts of yourself in the process. I hope you guys are able to sort of stay with me here. But how to overcome suicidal thoughts? I would say there are loads of different ways to be able to overcome suicidal thoughts from my personal experience. One of the main things that I find, use the Bible to overcome it. I agree, Nate. I do completely agree. I do think that scripture does help. For myself personally, I actually utilize my personal relationship with God. So it's not just, I guess, about having a relationship with his word, but actually having a personal relationship with God. Um, yeah. And I think that being able to have that kind of relationship gives me an opportunity to, I guess, not feel so alone in the process, because I think that's what happens a lot when we're sort of going through suicide. We feel very much isolated and alone. But even in the moments of isolation, it's kind of when God, gives you an opportunity to retreat from the world, so that he can have a personal one-to-one with you. That's kind of how I like to consider it. It's like personal one-on-one counseling times. You didn't know that you signed up for this session, but somewhere in time, God already knew that your heart was going to need that moment to just kind of sit and be still with him. And in those types of situations, it gives an opportunity for me to sit and ask suicide, why are you here? What purpose do you serve in my experience? Why are you so aggressive sometimes as well? That's one thing I've found myself asking myself when I found myself in situations where suicide has cropped up. Why are you so aggressive? And it gives me an opportunity to get a deeper understanding of my own self, because when we're dealing with suicidal thoughts, it's parts of ourselves that we're letting go of. It's parts of ourselves that is dying in the process. And it's almost like God is taking a moment to just kind of bring us in and say, this is a part of yourself that you're having to sacrifice whilst I take you through this change. And because we're disconnected from the process of the change, we're just focused on the outcome, right? We're completely focused on the outcome. We're not even taking consideration for the actual process of the journey. But this is where, when suicide sort of crops up, God takes an opportunity to take you under his wings and, give you an opportunity to be able to speak about what's going on your heart. What are some of the things that is contentious for you in that moment in life? Absolutely, Nate. And how can he be of service to you? How can he help you adjust? How can he help you sort of be able to keep the faith going as you're navigating through whatever shadows that you're sort of, allowing for your ego to go through in that moment? And no, that's perfectly fine. Thank you, Nate. Thank you. I think that it's important for us to be able to just acknowledge that personal relationship with God, because I think that I don't know how else I would have been able to get through suicidal thoughts. And I do understand in the society that we live in today, some people do have a very complicated relationship with God, and I get that. So I am going to give additional tools for you guys. And what I will say, as far as like a complicated relationship with God, is like any other relationship, it does need work. Sometimes we're frustrated with God based on our circumstances. We're not vocalizing where we are with our relationship. And it's like God's constantly asking us, what can I do better? What can I do differently? How can I be of better service to you? And it's just one of those things where we're not having an open enough dialogue. Nate said, I feel Christians tends to fall asleep on God and stuff, but all they need is prayer and wake up. Absolutely. I do agree that sometimes when, you know, things feel very, very intense and pressurized, we can find ourselves in situations, just going back into fear-based belief, because this is how I consider it, you know, God is that good nature within ourselves. It's that good nature that is always going to keep us in the light over any darkness, over any shadow that we may sort of come across or be faced with dealing with. And when we find ourselves in those situations, we really kind of have to work our way as well effectively. We have to kind of almost build a team. We have to become more of a team with ourselves, with the good nature within ourselves, to be able to combat the darkness, the shadow that kind of shows up. I think for people that have complicated relationships with God, it's not something that you need to feel any sense of judgment or shame about, because I think that that's something that may be a little bit difficult for some people as well. And I think because they feel you know, that their relationship with God isn't necessarily ideal, they don't necessarily know where to start, and there's a lot of shame that is holding people back from their relationship with God. What I would say is that God accepts you as you are, and you know, God's love, from my personal experience anyways, has been completely unconditional. So any conditions of God's love for you is something that you have created. It is a false narrative. It's a figment of your imagination. It's just like any other low vibrational thought. It's other people's projections, essentially. And that's what happens. That's another thing about suicide. A lot of the times, there are a lot of people's projections that we internalize. We take on their negative sayings, their negative thought patterns and beliefs. Somebody may have said in passing on social media, kill yourself, why are you still alive? And all of a sudden, 3 to 4 days, that seed that they've planted has now started to bud a little bit in the back of your subconscious mind. And a week later, you're finding yourself in situations where everything around you is feeling like you're wanting to kind of, basically, you're forced back into a corner where it feels like everything, the odds are all against you, you know, to the point where essentially you may feel like, I want to take my life. And those are some of the things that we have to be mindfully aware of. What are some of the projections of others that we take on? Why are we taking on those projections? Because those projections are building our belief systems. It's building the way that we're engaging in our relationship with ourselves, first and foremost. And it's also building the construct of our experiences externally. So we have to be careful about the kind of engagements and interactions that we have with people. I think that that's one of the biggest things that I would say when we're speaking about the art of spiritual warfare. You know, if you're dealing with someone that generally has a negative disposition about themselves, that tends to be very low, very dark in energy, very pessimistic, you will find yourself in situations where that kind of energy, that kind of spirit is attaching itself to, and all of a sudden, before you know it, that spirit that is attaching itself to, that spirit of just pure pessimism, that spirit of hopelessness, that spirit of discouragement is now growing. It's starting to brew. It's starting to fester away in the back of your subconscious mind. And now it's engaging itself, attaching itself to one of your subpersonalities. Your subpersonalities are, you know, the parts of your subconscious mind that you don't realize that's actually a part of your creating process, because your conscious mind is only aware of 5% of the inner workings of why you do the things that you do, you know, whereas the subconscious mind is pretty much the intention and everything that has conditioned that intention to become a reality. And I think when we're speaking about, you know, overcoming suicidal thoughts, it really is a case of breaking it down into different practices that can be done. I've mentioned on a daily basis, weekly basis, bi-weekly and monthly basis. So I am going to go through a few of those. I've managed to structure myself for you guys this time, so I'm learning. But I think when we think about, what are some of the day-to-day challenges that may trigger suicidal thoughts, I think that that's something that's very, very important to touch in on, because everybody's situation is different and everybody's circumstances are different to them. For some people, they may find breakups to be very, very difficult because they don't know how to be on their own. They don't know how to be by themselves. They have a fear of abandonment that has driven them into the state of depression from losing this person. And now that fear of abandonment, by the loss of that relationship, is manifesting as suicidal thoughts, because it is going through a process of grieving that relationship, of letting that relationship die. Suicide is a very, very tricky sort of entity to navigate through. I can't lie to you. It's very, very tricky. You have to peel back the layers to understand what triggers have formulated what pattern that is showing up as suicide, because the reality is suicide is it's almost like a end product of an initial causation. So when we talk about the law of cause and effect, the effects of a depressive thought or feeling or emotion is what is manifesting as suicidal thoughts. So we have to get to the root cause as to, where is suicide coming from within us? What experience is actually really putting us into focus of feeling like we are at a place where we want to sort of be suicidal. One of the things that, Spirit, my guides, my angels are kind of guiding me to sort of speak about at the minute is just really my own personal experience of suicide. I mentioned to you that just as I was coming into my 30th cycle, I dealt with suicidal thoughts for a wave up and down. The astrology does also have a big impact on when we're likely to experience suicidal thoughts as well. The weather also impacts whether or not we're sort of inclined to have suicidal thoughts, because the weather is actually also a physical manifestation of what's going on energetically with Mother Gaia and Mother Earth. So that also plays a very, very crucial part. But my personal experience of suicide last year, as I was coming into this 30th cycle, there was a part of myself that was basically judging me. There was a part of myself. So at 30, I don't think she had all of these big dreams and aspirations and all these things that she thought that she wanted to be. So this is a version of me before I got to this place in my life, right? And she felt as though she wanted to be married with children, and that was all that she kind of saw for being in her 30s. Mind you, I am an intuitive. So I actually know that my timeline, the things that I want, I'm very clear. I'm connected directly to my own personal spirit and my own personal essence and core. And I know the timeline for my children, because I'm in communication and contact with my spirit babies every single day, to be fair. And it was just interesting to watch that part of my ego die, because it felt like it wanted to have all of these different things that I don't personally feel like I'm ready for just yet. And I can understand why it's not a part of my personal experience just yet, because spirit sees and knows my heart that I'm not actually ready for that. I don't want it. It's actually something that I was conditioned by the external world to believe was a desire of mine. But as I grew older, I realized that that's not actually what I want for my life. That's not who I see myself as at that stage of my life. And I had to outgrow that. That's what happens a lot of the times when we are outgrowing different parts of ourselves, when we're outgrowing different experiences, when we are outgrowing different circumstances. It may show up as suicidal thoughts. When I was having those conversations with that spirit that was, I guess, manifesting through me, because that's the best way that I can put it, this was a part of myself that was disappointed with my circumstances coming into my 30th cycle. And I really had to have a conversation with myself and really just address myself to just be clear that that wasn't my personal expectation of life. Having gotten to this stage of life, I outgrew that, and I realized that that wasn't even actually what I wanted. That's what society told me was necessary for them to accept me, and I succumbed to that actual expectation, and all of a sudden I made it something that I was living by. That's what happens a lot with suicidal thoughts. Sometimes we are letting go of parts of ourselves that are no longer serving us. We're letting go of parts of ourselves that no longer resonates with us. And as we're letting go of those parts of ourselves, as we're shedding our skin, as we're growing into that next best version of ourselves, it's almost like we start to hear the silent whispers of the parts of ourselves that's dying within ourselves, within the being of our avatar. Because again, everything speaks to us, every single cell. Sometimes, because meditation actually really does help to attune the avatar, to attune the vessel, guys. And when we get to a place of being attuned, it will get to a point sometimes where listening to every single cell or every part of your being that speaks, because we're kind of like a radio channel, constantly just, sat there interpreting everything. It's very, very difficult for the avatar to interpret every single experience. That's why we need to make it more of a normal sort of conversation for us to have conversations about combating suicidal thoughts, and why a person would even feel suicidal. Because a lot of the times people don't even, they're so scared to ask them why they feel suicidal. There's no building a rapport with that feeling. There's no building a rapport with that emotion, the density of that emotion that is manifesting as a suicidal thought. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to engage completely in the thought of suicide, so we don't have to then fulfill the act basically of suicide, but we can sit within it to understand it, to overcome it, to understand it, to understand why it's here and why it's showing up. It was beautiful for me to understand that there was a part of myself that was disappointed with my own personal progress in life, when my higher self, my higher consciousness, my spirit is so proud of where I am, of my existence in life, where I am at this particular point of the journey, just being able to engage in the process instead of the outcome, which was what was happening with my ego coming into my 30th cycle. I realized that I could address it, and I can thank suicide for bringing that to surface for me. But again, because we don't necessarily know how to sit within our emotions, to go through emotion of processing our emotions, we miss out on so many great opportunities for spiritual awakenings and self-realizations. How to combat suicidal thoughts, guys? There are so many different avenues that we can go down. For daily practices, I definitely recommend meditation. I said it already before, but it is something I consider to be me dictation. It kind of quiets all the voices in your mind. It quiets all the thoughts, basically. It quiets all the noise. Sometimes our mind becomes so busy. It's like a traffic sort of build up, because there's so many thoughts, and sometimes we come to these junctions where we have to make certain decisions, and because there's so many thoughts going on and our mind isn't necessarily clear, we're not sure about what decision we are wanting to make. Because of that, we then sort of find ourselves being indecisive, then creating stagnancy as a byproduct of that, which can again lead into depression, which can then lead to suicidal thoughts. It's a very, very tricky shadow to navigate through, because there's so many. It's very sensitive, suicide, basically. That's the best way that I can put it. It's very sensitive. It's like being in a bomb site. You never know where to step, because it's like there's mines everywhere and they're hidden, and you kind of have to be careful about what trigger may sort of take you to a place where all of a sudden there's a seed of suicide that's planted in your subconscious mind, and you have to be careful not to nurture that seed, not to harvest the seed, not to really sort of give any energy to that seed, because unfortunately, sometimes people project their negativity. That's the reality we live in. Sadly, it's a cruel world. And depending on where they are on their own journeys, depending on the moon cycles, wherever the moon is, sometimes we may be triggered in our heart center. Sometimes we're going through heart chakra activation that may show up in cruelty, basically. And those types of situations, somebody triggering, the other person by being cruel, that can very easily spiral into suicidal thoughts. This is why we have to be mindfully aware of how we're engaging with ourselves, how we're engaging with the people around us, and how much accountability we're taking for ourselves as well. And that's why I think meditation is important. It gives us an opportunity to get deeper connected to our personal self, our spirit, the core of our essence. And also, sometimes I find that through meditation, my own consciousness, the voice of my own consciousness, becomes louder than all of the other background noise, all of the other thoughts of other people, basically, that have been projected in my orbit, trying to impact and infiltrate my creation process, basically trying to condition the person that I am. And it's about trying to stay in your authenticity. And that's what suicide is. A lot of the times you are just, like I said, shedding the skin of the old. And as your ego is dying, sometimes it may seem encouraging to basically take the vessel out with it, but we have to be consciously aware enough that no, this is actually a DNA activation. This is an old cell that was living in trauma, that was living in a low vibrational experience of itself. It's actually transmuting, and it is going through a transcended state where it's evolving into a high vibration. And this is actually a beautiful experience. You know, if we can have more of those conversations and see the beauty, I'm not saying that suicide is like super awesome. That's not what I'm saying. I know that it's a challenge, guys. Don't get me wrong. Like I said, I had like a 6-week span of going in and out of Shadow Island, where I was on suicide ward, where it was just constant suicidal thoughts day in, day out. But guess what? I learned so much about myself. I learned so much about parts of myself that was dying. I learned so much about stupid things, stupid expectations, stupid judgments that I had, that was building my belief system. And as I was leaving that version of myself, as I was leaving that girl behind, it was inevitable that suicidal thoughts were going to come, because I didn't fulfill those expectations. I didn't meet those requirements. I didn't engage in those aspirations. Guess what? It wasn't actually me. Turns out, go figures. But that's what suicide can do for a person. I think, like, even to touch in on, because the inspiration behind this was basically to do with the Caroline Flack situation. If she had known exactly what her her death was going to do to impact the lives of others, I think that it would be just as beautiful of an experience for her to go into her transition into her spiritual form, her spiritual phase of life. But also knowing that if she had also made it through to the other end, there would have been a completely different transition of life for her. There would have been a completely different way of an outcome for her. And I think that's what happens in suicide. We feel like there's no way out. We feel like this is the only alternative. I must die to make myself feel better in the moment of the situation. But that's not the reality. A part of yourself is dying, yes, but you don't necessarily have to take yourself out with it. It's a part of your consciousness that is no longer serving. It's a part of your awareness that is now getting an opportunity to be expanded upon some old ideals that may no longer be serving you, but they served a purpose up until that point. It's really just about engaging in a conscious experience of ourselves, guys. I think that's the best way that I can put it when we're talking about suicide in itself. But other daily practices, getting back into some of the tools for you guys. Teas, so stuff like herbal teas. Mugwort is very good for intuition and intuitive development. Stuff like that really does help to be able to kind of ground ourselves. Foods as well, the foods that we eat does help to ground ourselves. So when we find ourselves kind of going through situations where we're dealing or combating suicidal thoughts or depression in itself, there's certain foods that we can eat. Vegan diet, it's not to plug or push vegan diet here, guys, just bear with me. So vegan diet generally tends to promote a higher state of mentalism. It promotes a higher state of consciousness. So because you're dealing with life-based elements, you're putting life-based elements into your body. So you're dealing with fresh life, fresh source of life. It makes it a little bit easier for you to be able to combat shadows. If you're somebody, for instance, that is eating a lot of meat, what's happening is you're building up a lot of density, and you're also taking on a lot of debt. You are literally putting death in your body every single time you're eating that meat. I've literally been in a situation before where I was having some wings, because I've said before, I'm an intuitive, I'm an empath. So I was having some wings once, and I remember I just started crying. I was like, oh my God, I can feel the pain, the death of the wings that were sacrificed. So it is essentially death that we're eating when we sort of have those types of situations, because every soul has a purpose in its existence. Even when we have fruits as well, I do want to put this across because I've raveled into depression before just from a Sharon fruit. And that's because your Sharon fruit was like really bruised. It's been through some things. Life basically took its toll on the Sharon fruit. And it sent me into a state of depression. Whilst I was eating it, my guides, the universe, God, said to me, are you sure you want to eat that? You know, it looks like it's been through some stuff. I'm like, it's okay. I'll have it anyways. And guess what? 2-3 days later, I was actually dealing with just a small bats of psychosis and depressive thoughts that were leading into suicide. So we have to be careful what we put into our bodies, because these things do impact our DNA. That's literally pretty much the rate that we're vibrating on, the things that we eat as well. So food is definitely a big plus. Vegan plant-based diet does help to overcome the challenges of suicidal thoughts, because it does elevate the consciousness into a high vibration, especially freshly sourced fruits and veg are very, very important. Other things that I would recommend, I've always got crystals constantly, all the time. They absorb energy, and it's important to be able to kind of let some of the energy that you're kind of holding, whatever energy that is really, really dense to the point where it's manifesting as suicidal thoughts in your mind, it really has to go through a process of being alchemized. In crystals, basically, they can absorb energy. So whatever energy you're kind of, I guess, vibrating at, it's kind of deflecting. It's almost like you're deflecting that low vibration onto the crystal, unfortunately. But you can clear these things, you can charge them, and they are not as emotionally fueled and as emotionally attached to things as we are. Okay, they understand their purpose in life, except we're a little bit more primitive in nature. Other things that I'd probably recommend as far as daily uses: affirmations, definitely a must. Affirmations make a difference to the way that we're actually able to engage with those low vibrational reflections of ourselves. EFT, so emotional freedom technique, is kind of going one step further with affirmations. And you can also do mirror work with this as well, which means that you do the EFT tapping on the pressure points, releasing those negative energies, releasing those suicidal thoughts through EFT, tapping those pressure points within your body, and putting in positive affirmations instead. You know, it's like tapping out the low vibrations, or releasing them from your body, and putting in more higher transcended states into your body, as far as what your body needs to remember now, because you're building your body's belief system about itself, because the pain body remembers everything. You know, muscle memory, it will remember everything. So now that you're releasing the things that it's remembered about itself, and you're now reprogramming it with EFT tapping into those pressure points, is very, very good to be able to use positive affirmations. And mirror work helps you to be able to just almost see the magic as it takes place. That's probably the best way that I can put it. Just watching the process of the transition taking place. If you can do that with some meditation in there as well, just combining everything. I've done that, and honestly, the transition in itself was literally a matter of maybe 2 or 3 days, because it just happened so quickly. Another thing that I'd probably recommend as far as daily, NLP definitely works, neuro-linguistic programming. So it's all about deprogramming the mind and reprogramming it into just kind of knowing how to navigate your way through your neurological pathways of your mind. So there may be certain blockages that your mind may have developed based on your conditioning throughout your childhood between the ages of 0 to 7. And it's a case of going back into some of those old files that has been archived, because technically we never forget anything, we just archive information. So we take it away from the forefront of our mind, put it into our subconscious mind, and it's still on, you know, the file is still open in our subconscious mind. We're just no longer aware of it, because it's not something that is in the 5% of our conscious mind's awareness. Okay, so NLP will help us to be able to deprogram those stuff and reprogram in a way that will help us to be able to get the kind of results that we're looking for. And another thing that I would recommend is self-counseling and journaling. Journaling can help with self-counseling, and it can really give us an opportunity to be able to get new insight and perspective about who we are as people and how we can better sort of navigate into a different reality than our current version of our experiences. So it's just more or less a case of us being able to know where we are on the journey, acknowledge where we are on the journey, identify ways that can help us to actually get a little bit further along the process, ways that may allow for us to just have a different experience that is probably more conducive to what we would like to see for ourselves, that kind of thing. What I would say as well is that when we're dealing with, you know, the day-to-day challenges of suicide, it's important to be able to also just let somebody know, reach out and let someone know that you're going through some stuff right now. You don't have to give them the ins and outs of your situation if you're not that comfortable with, you know, certain individuals in your life just yet. But it's definitely very important to reach out and just let somebody know. That way they're at least on suicide watch for you. And they know to experience, to just understand that there may be something deeper going on beneath the surface. So it's not about making any judgments or haste decisions on your situation. It's just about being a support for you and giving you an opportunity to have a sounding board to just vocalize whatever it is that you're going through. So definitely, you know, just let somebody know that you're going through some stuff right now. And you just kind of really need a friend. I think that definitely helps, because then people are aware and they can act accordingly. Bi-weekly things that I can recommend that you guys can do. I say, for me personally, some of the things that I do bi-weekly, I do new moon and full moon practices. I mentioned to you guys earlier that I do definitely believe that astrology, as above, so below. So I do believe that astrology does impact the way in which we are experiencing certain day-to-day engagements and interactions, and depending on where the moon is in any given day, because the moon impacts our emotions, I utilize the energies basically to kind of just close out certain chapters and plant new seeds, set intentions. So new moons, I would use new moons, like for instance, we just had the Pisces new moon on Sunday, and because at the minute we have Mercury in retrograde, which probably means nothing to you guys, but basically essentially what it means in terms of astrology, people are basically just highly sensitive at the minute. They are probably on guard. Their ego is probably very, very sensitive right now, and people's demons are just waiting for an opportunity to project at somebody, just the smallest of things basically. It doesn't even have to be anything too big, but people are just really living in a place where they're purging some of their old reflections of self. And as we're going through that, those old reflections may either be projected or they may be processed. It depends. Either way, it's going to come up to surface, because spirit is asking for these things to be addressed and transmuted in the process. Okay, when you're doing it consciously, then you can do conscious work, i.e. setting intentions as and when spirit is guiding you to do so. So with the Pisces new moon, we were being guided essentially to set intentions for just planting new subconscious programmings, planting new subconscious seed, because Pisces is the 12th house, it's completing cycles. So we've completed a cycle of the old stuff that is no longer serving us, and we're now looking to plant new seeds to basically see the trajectory of where we are by August. I think the Pisces full moon, if I'm not mistaken, is on the 3rd of August. So whatever intentions you'll be planting now, you'd be able to start to see the cultivation of it by around about August. And this is what happens when you're working again consciously. You have a timeline to work by. You don't have to let your ego override you, because the ego's on about instant gratification. When you're working consciously and you're utilizing the energies of new moon and full moon, and you know what seeds you're planting, and at what portals, when I say portals, I mean what energetic timestamps. So with me saying, you know, the new moon, the moon was in Pisces on Sunday, and that was a Pisces new moon. That's the timestamp basically for me setting certain intentions. Some of the intentions that I set, just to even overshare, I guess, for this Pisces new moon was I am affirmation. So I just kind of affirmed to myself that I am worthy, I am important, I do deserve my blessings, I am open to receiving my blessings. And I literally, for myself, I, set that out there into the universe. I put it out there. I did go deeper into my ritual, to be fair, in terms of like how I utilize the energy in itself, and those affirmations. But again, that's for people who are a little bit deeper into the alchemy of their experiences. I do practice the art of alchemy, conscious living. That's how I consider it. So I did sort of go through a process that was a little bit deeper, but I'll give you guys that for a bit of an overshare, just to sort of give you guys some kind of clarity of what I mean when I say planting or setting intentions or planting seeds. New moons are great for that kind of energy because it's when the moon is at its darkest. So this is where, the universe is ready to receive your requests. Even in the Bible, even in scripture, it speaks about, God asking for us to be able to put our petitions in. So that's what I consider it. I consider this my time, my personal time, where I'm very much, having a relationship with my creator as a co-creator, where I'm being very precise and clear to God about what my intentions are for, my creating process, what my intentions are for the version of myself that I'm looking to manifest by August of this year, because I'm going to be on a 6 months trajectory with that, creating that version of myself. And I'm willing to commit to the process of nurturing, mending, and tending that seed for the next 6 months. So we have to be very careful as well. A lot of the times we're so frivolous when we say certain things, we don't actually realize that the things that we're saying is really creating our experiences. Thank you, Area 81. I like your good vibes, actually. But it really is just one of the thank you. I appreciate the accent. It's just one of those situations that really makes a difference to how a situation sort of pans out, basically. If we're in circumstances where we're just left to just drift, we will do that. If we're not clear about what it is that we're trying to create, guess what? How can God, the universe, the creator, whatever you want to call it, how does your angels and guides even know what they're working on with you? A lot of the times we don't even know what we want ourselves, because we're not taking the time to have those types of conversations. And I think that's what I guess these practices do for myself. It gives me an opportunity to engage with myself, to be clear with myself, to be open and honest with myself about what it is that I'm creating. And again, I can do so consciously, because I'm not just letting my subconscious mind create my experience and playing victim to the things that my subpersonalities kind of manifest as a result of their past trauma and wounds, because I'm working actively towards getting away from creating more of those types of stories where it's like you're a victim of just everything that you experience in life. It's like, no, I actually can see how I created this. This was a decision that I made that actually connects to this decision, and this is the outcome. And okay, I can see how I created this karma for myself. Because a lot of the times we want to take no accountability for sin, and that's what sin is. It's when we create negative karma for ourselves. And if we can take accountability, guess what? We actually have the power back in our control. We actually have the power back in our hands. Whereas if we're a victim to the circumstances that we've created, then that puts our power outside of ourselves. It means that somebody else is responsible. And it also means that somebody else, again, is then going to be responsible for making or creating a change in the situation. And I don't recommend that for anyone, personally speaking. With the bi-weekly practices, for full moon sort of releases, some of the things that I do in those types of experiences. So I would probably write a few things that I'm releasing. So for instance, if I want to be able to, I know the next time that I'm going to do my petition to God, the universe, the next time I'm doing that, I want to create structure for myself. What may be something that may be standing in my way of structure at this full moon? I would release that. For instance, I've released the spirit of dysfunction, because that's something I grew up in dysfunction. So that's a generational pattern and trait. So I've released the spirit of dysfunction so that I can create structure. So those are some of the things that I would utilize the full moon to do. Just release things that are no longer serving the versions of myself that I'm trying to work towards. So obstacles that may be sort of prohibiting the process of what I'm working towards, I release those at full moons, and then at new moons I'll set new intentions of just the things that I want to be able to manifest. So I always kind of have my eye on what's going on astrologically, because because I'm an intuitive as well, I get very, very deeply impacted by the emotions depending on where the moon is. So I always need to know at all times. Another bi-weekly tool that I can recommend is self-assessment. So because we have new moons and full moons on every 2 weeks, why I think that this is a good practice is because every 2 weeks you would have gone through a transformation somehow. You would have gone through some sort of transformation for a seed that you have planted, or you would have gone through some sort of transformation for some part of yourself that is no longer serving you, that you've released. So every 2 weeks, it's really a case of just checking in with yourself and being like, okay, where are we with the situation? How can I do better? Do I need some more time to rest as well? Because that's one of the things I make sure that I take efficient time to rest as well, because guess what will manifest if we don't do that? Suicidal thoughts. That happens a lot. When we push ourselves too hard, what happens is that, the parts of ourselves, our ego that wants to just basically wait for the results of everything to happen, our ego will attack us back, unfortunately, sometimes. And when the ego kind of goes into that mode of, I'm going to be an enemy instead of a actual team player in this experience that we're having, then it gets very, very tricky having to navigate through the process of what you're going through. It's important to do self-assessments, because then you can sit in with your ego, you can sit down with because a lot of the times, especially as conscious people, we talk about being in this experience where we have the higher self that's having this human experience. We need to be able to live consciously enough to be aware of that and have that kind of engagement with ourselves and have that kind of dialogue with ourselves. So, Avatar, I talk to myself in third person probably more than the people around me would like to see me do, but it's important because and sometimes I will say, 3-year-old Shakima, absolutely, Area 81, or 6-year-old Shakima. One of the things that I realized going into my 30th cycle this year was that I had a lot of trauma from my 3-year-old version of myself. There was a lot of daddy issue wounds there. There was a lot of fear of abandonment there. And I had to address those things. But because I had already outgrown that experience, because my life had continued, I had to disassociate myself from it so that I wasn't reliving it. But I then had to also acknowledge 3-year-old Shakima's experience so that, one, that part of myself knows that, I am heard by someone very important, the only person that really actually matters in my world, which is myself. And then giving myself an opportunity to be able to say, do you know what, 3-year-old Shakima, we're not going to do that anymore. What can I do to facilitate a space for your healing? And listening to that part of myself, listening to that child within myself and what that part of myself actually requires to be able to enable me to do the things that I want to do as the adult version of myself. Because 3-year-old Shakima was still playing out a story that I no longer identified with, that I no longer resonated with, that I just no longer felt was like my personal identity. And I had to help her disengage from that and basically create something else. So I think that self-assessment is an important part of the bi-weekly process. I'm going to go back to the weekly process because I think I skipped over that and went directly to the bi-weekly process. But weekly, I think some little things that, one can do to sort of combat suicidal thoughts is just get themselves into a routine, get into a routine of doing the things that you love. Exercise is really good to sort of release certain endorphins, get certain chemicals flowing through the body, through the avatar, and it really helps to transcend certain states of consciousness as well. Breathing exercises really helps, but I guess meditation can, help with that as well. Doing stuff like yoga, walking, running, just spending time in nature, making like a weekly appointment with nature is very, very important, is what I'd say, because it gives our body an opportunity to, again, we're so disconnected from Mother Gaia, not realizing that we are from and of the earth. We have to take an opportunity to just kind of go back into the natural element of things, and just let nature heal us, at least once a week. All we have to do is sit there and take it in, guys. It's actually not even that difficult. I know it's a little bit tricky with our weather at the minute here in the UK, but such is life. If you've got a balcony, stay out on the balcony for 10 to 15 minutes at least once a week. Get some fresh air. Moving on to monthly suggestions that I can make, I think building an overall rapport with yourself. So it's kind of like wrapping up old chapters and making way for new beginnings, because I look at every month as a chapter of our lives for each year. So every year we have 12 chapters. And that's just my personal sort of outlook on it. I tend to be very quirky with these things. It's just how my mind identifies with things. And with these 12 chapters, every month I kind of do like an overall assessment. Okay, how do I feel sort of closing out the end of February? Okay, did I do everything that I wanted to do? Yes and no. What were some of the things that I didn't get an opportunity to do? Okay, am I okay with letting that manifest over the course of the next month? You know what I mean? Just to kind of give ourselves an opportunity to kind of work towards our goals. A lot of the times we have goals and we don't necessarily know how to navigate our way towards those goals. Instead, we just kind of drift aimlessly and hope for the best. And that doesn't help, because when our ego is bruised and our ego is about to go through an ego death, it is going to manifest as suicidal thoughts. Okay, because that ego is dying, and as the ego is dying, it may encourage us to take the avatar with it. We don't need to go down that road. So I think that just overall monthly reports really help as well. One of the things that I do, because we have our inner child, and our inner child is actually, from my personal experience, the ego is very much more like the inner child. Because it's all about instant gratification. It's just about the human version of ourselves, essentially, whereas the higher consciousness would be the spiritual version of ourselves. But when we're dealing with inner child situations, on a monthly basis, it's important to be able to encourage the child. That's one thing that I find, giving myself encouragement about certain things and giving myself deadlines, because sometimes we want to do certain things, but then the spirit of procrastination hits us and we're just like, oh, I don't know that I want to do that today. Let's try it tomorrow. Tomorrow never comes. Let's try it next week. Next week is a myth. And then before we know it, we're like months later, we haven't gotten any progress, and there's just stagnancy. We're feeling like we feel of less value to ourselves, basically. And that's because a part of us doesn't feel worthy. And we have to accept that first and foremost. We have to acknowledge what part of ourselves that is. And then we have to do the necessary work, because guess what? When we continue to do more of that, that will only take us into a place of suicidal thoughts. That will only take us into a place of feeling like we're not good enough for the world. So why do we need to be here? We have to kind of learn how to not engage in certain spirits, basically. It's not even about just combating the spirits when they show up. It's about learning how to not engage in certain spirits altogether. And I think that that's what some of these tools that I'm recommending to you guys can give you an opportunity to do. Like monthly overall reports will give you an opportunity to say, look, I'm doing an awesome job. Bensi, for instance, saying to yourself, yeah, like we're doing an awesome job today. This is an area that we need to brush up on. That's okay. Like, it's just like treating it as you would your own kids. Like, how would you encourage and motivate your own children? Because this is what we find a lot of the times, because we don't do it for ourselves. There's parents out there that don't actually know how to do it for their own children, because they haven't taken the time to parent themselves in that way, and they give their kids what they have, and what they have may not necessarily be good enough to kind of let that child, thrive into adult life, essentially. The next sort of time span that we're looking at, basically, as far as these types of maintenance, because that's what it is when we're talking about suicidal thoughts, maintenance, I'd say 6 months as well. It's always worth a check-in. Every 3 to 6 months, just kind of checking in with yourself with a progress report as well, where it's just checking in on our mental health and our mental state, because essentially that's what's happening when we're having suicidal thoughts. There's some point where our mental welfare has kind of, I wouldn't say hit rock bottom, but it's gone through some sort of significant challenge and it's taken a dip. And we need to know where that dip is to be able to identify it first and foremost, and put some systems in place to be able to navigate through it. You know, those things are important to the healing process. Otherwise, we just leave ourselves susceptible to these dark forces like suicidal thoughts. At the 6 months point, I think it's good to be able to do a progress report. Like I said, when we do new moon and full moon sort of practices, every sort of seed that you plant at a new moon has a 6 months timeline. It has a 6 months trajectory. So that's where you'd be able to do sort of a progress report to say, okay, where am I with that seed? Where am I with that intention? How far have I come? Can I see the progress with that? And what would be the next steps for me moving forward to be able to make the most of this opportunity, or maybe to be able to improve upon my current results? You know, it's just really treating life like we came here to actually be students of life. I think that we've forgotten that. That's probably the one thing that I'd say, that I think that we've forgotten that we're students of life and we're just aimlessly drifting, free floating, assuming that things are just going to happen by happenstance, and that's just not how things work. In some cases, there are certain things that we have to be very clear about, because it's either we're clear about it subconsciously or we're clear about it consciously. You know, being aware of what we're doing, being engaged in what we're doing, being a willing partner and participant of what we're doing. Whereas when we're doing things subconsciously, we're going into auto drive, we're going into the default programs of what we have been conditioned to do in circumstances once triggered. It's basically going into what the body knows when it is in a situation where it's been triggered to go fight or flight. And we don't want to sort of keep creating from those types of experiences. So for me personally, I would say 6 months is also a really, really good time to be able to check back in, do a progress report, and just look and see how far you've come with the goals and whether or not you've actually aligned with the goal that you initially set for yourself 6 months prior to that. Okay. I hope that that was useful for you guys. That is pretty much everything that I actually put down to come into the space and discuss with you guys tonight. I hope that you guys have found it to be, you know, very, very beneficial for you guys. We've had a lot of people that came in and out of the room tonight, which was lovely. I opened up the floor as far as a free space a little bit more than usual tonight. So I'm glad to see that so many of you guys were able to sort of come in and out of the space tonight. That is beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. If you guys are interested in, you know, just working through some of these things, utilizing some of the practices that I've mentioned, going deeper, talking to me, connecting with me on social media, just little things like that, I'm literally just going to put in my link in the actual chat so that you guys can connect with me for just some of the other stuff in life, you know, some of the other stuff that you may feel like I would be suitable for in terms of your life experiences. On that note, if you guys would like to connect with me on any of my social media channels, I have the link just here for you guys, so you guys can do so, and you'll be able to kind of hear details of it. Consciously Connected is my brand. That is my business. That is my business entity that I operate under as Shakima Brown. If you guys want to check me out on social media, it's Consciously Connected. On Instagram, Shakima on Facebook, Shakima Brown on my YouTube channel. And yeah, that's pretty much everything from me, guys. On that note, I'm going to love you guys and leave it there for you. I will see you guys whenever I see you guys again. Thank you for being awesome troopers. And I am signing out. I'll see you guys in the next session. You guys take care. Blessings. Mwah.